Hello, my name is Fox, and this is my presentation on scale and the St. Jacobs market. Start with an outline. So obviously I'm going to start with talking about scale and what the textbook has to say about it. Then I'm going to go on to the market, its history, and how we're using it today, and then my answer to the reflection questions. So the simple definition that the textbook gives us for scale is that within human geography, scale is typically seen in one of two ways, either as a real material thing which actually exists and is the result of political struggle and or social processes, or as a way of framing our understanding of the world. Next, we're going to get into the history of scale and how our understanding of scale has changed over time. So while scale is typically a core concept of geography, prior to the 1980s, there wasn't a lot of thought put into what scale is. It was just something that kind of got used mostly to impose world orders. And frequently, the idea of scale was split into regional or national frameworks for research projects. So in the 80s, things started to change a little bit in geography. We get Peter Taylor, who publishes a couple of articles, and we also get Neil Smith, who publishes Uneven Development. And this kind of begins a debate over what scale is. And it kind of splits into two sides. We've got the side that thinks it is a material process, something that exists in the world, and we've got a side that thinks of it as more of a heuristic for understanding the world. And we've also got the Kantian thinkers and the Marxists. The Kantian thinkers that understand scale is no more than a handy conceptual mechanism for ordering the world, whereas the Marxists draw upon ideas of materialism to argue that scales were real social products, and as such, there was a politics to their construction. Of course, you can't have a new academic theory without people criticizing that theory. So one of the critiques that was brought to discussions regarding scale was that the existing theories were very capital centric. So in response to this, Smith starts studying the effects of political struggles and how that shapes the scale making processes. And he specifically looked at anti-gentrification activists in New York City. The 80s, of course, being kind of the beginning of modern globalization, meant that there was a lot of concern about whether or not economic regions really existed, or whether they were as tied up in efforts to reconstruct regional geography that we saw previously. There was a lot of focus on regional formation, and the way that debate happened still affects how we conceptualize the idea of the global and the local. In the late 1990s, Kevin Cox introduces us to two new ideas, spaces of dependence and spaces of engagement. So spaces of dependence are more or less localized social relations upon which we depend for the realization of essential interest and for which there are no substitutions elsewhere. Spaces of engagement are spaces through which social actors construct associations with actors located elsewhere. Thus, Cox wants us to understand scale as something that's produced between two people's spaces of dependence, and something that he refers to as a strategy of engagement. Thus, Cox understands scale as something that is produced and emergent, and it occurs between people's spaces of dependence across distance, and they work together in a strategy of engagement. And it's in that networking that we see scale be produced. In the early 2000s, Sally Marston publishes some works on scale. It suggests that there's still a gap in the scalar theories and that they are still focused very heavily on how capital is produced, and that there's not enough focus on social reproduction and consumption. So there's not enough focus. Her particular interest was on patriarchy and how scale plays into patriarchy, and she did a lot of research and writing on scale at the household level. In 2001, we have Neil Brenner, who tries to address what he considers the noticeable slippage in the literature between notions of geographical scale and other core geographical concepts such as place, locality, territory, and scale that had occurred since geographers began to evaluate scale's ontological status. Specifically, Brenner believes that Smith's use of political scale uses the term scale too broadly. Brenner also takes specific aim at Marston and the use of the household as a scale, suggests that geographers are diluting the analytical power of the concepts of scale when he thinks that these things might be better fitted using the terminology politics of place or politics of territory. Marston and Smith then work together to counter Brenner's critiques by suggesting that Brenner's efforts to separate production of space and production of scale, and that while they are separate, it's impossible to fully separate the concepts since the production of scale is integral to the production of space. Next, we get into what the textbook calls the discourses of the global and the local. It says the global and the local are often understood to be at opposite ends of a scalar spectrum. Using this binary, Gibson and Graham identified at least 6 ways of understanding that relationship. These 6 ways are as followed. The global and local can be understood as a framework for analysis. They can only be understood in contrast to each other. They are part of a network, not a hierarchy. The global is local or multi-local. The local is global, and that they are not locations but processes. To explain how global and local are used as frameworks for analysis, Gibson and Graham use economic restructuring, where if you're looking at restructuring from a global scale at a particular point in time, things may be appearing to be slowing down. But if you were to look at a local level during the same period of time, the local level might actually be experiencing an expansion and not a slowdown. For the second point, basically means that global and local derive meaning from what they are not, and that they make most sense in contrast to each other. Although it is important to note that historically local meant things other than national, but now we're comparing local to global. So in this case, a single country might be considered local in comparison to the global scale, kind of depending on what the conversation is. So the meaning of local has shifted over time. So we also start to see global and local as networks and not part of a hierarchy. The metaphor used in the textbook is that of a spider's web, where it's impossible to tell where one part of a web starts and another part begins. So it's not global and local. They exist on kind of a sliding spectrum, and therefore you can't really put them in a hierarchy, one above the other. They're networked and interconnected with kind of more or less connections depending on specifically where you're talking about. Gibson and Graham also argue that the global is local, and that if you really think about something that's global and start to scratch under the surface, you will find a locality within it. Even if you think of an idea of a multinational company, it's not so much that they're multinational or that they're global, but they're actually multi-local, is how Gibson and Graham describe it. Conversely, the local is also global, where the local is where the global touches down. But they describe it similar to the tips of an octopus's leg might touch particular locations on the seafloor while the body of the octopus floats above it. Such is the approach that the local appears as the location where global forces touch down on the Earth's surface. As such, the local isn't necessarily a specific place, but it's an entry point into global flows. The text also describes global and local not as specific locations, but as processes. Put another way, globalization and localization produce all spaces as hybrids, or as glocal sites, as the textbook puts it. One way that you can see this is in McDonald's, where McDonald's is all over the globe, but what it looks like in specific locations is different to match the local interests. Because it's kind of difficult to understand something like scale that is both tiny and massive at the same time, there are a lot of different metaphors used to try and describe it, and they all have slightly different connotations. A common one is a ladder, where typically you see local at the bottom rung, then you'll get regional, national, and global. And because you climb ladders, this metaphor reinforces or creates a hierarchy between those scales. Another metaphor used is concentric circles, where the larger scales encompass the smaller scales, but there's not necessarily a hierarchy there, it's kind of on a flat plane. You've also got nesting dolls that are similar to concentric circles, where there's not necessarily a hierarchy involved. You have to understand the dolls in context to get a complete picture. You can't just pull out one doll and understand the whole thing. You have to look at that doll next to its neighbors, and understand them all together. And then we also have tree roots. The textbook also described this as the worm burrow section. Basically, it's networks where scales are networked together, there's no discrete levels, there's less of a hierarchy involved, and it's a lot more things interconnecting and weaving back and forth. Now we're going to get on to the St. Jacobs Market, which you can see on the map here. It's about 30 minutes kind of southwest-ish from Guelph, which Guelph isn't marked on the map just because of the scale, but it's about 30 minutes from the university. Now we've got a brief timeline of the history of the markets. It started in 1952. It was actually located in Kitchener at the time, and it was known as the Stockyards Farmer Market. In 75, the Kitchener and Waterloo separate stockyards markets merged together and moved to the present market location, which was the one marked on the map in the previous slide. In 87, they built their two-level market building is constructed so they can have more vendors and have some indoor space. 91, the market officially changes its name to the St. Jacobs Farmers Market and Flea Market. In 2000, the Waterloo's Farmers Market, which is kind of across the street from the St. Jacobs buildings, are purchased and then renovated. In 2005, the Sunday market opened, so they'd had, I believe it was Tuesdays and Thursdays. Now the Sunday market's like a whole other thing that they're doing. In 2009, they renovate one of their buildings to convert it full time into their marketplace building for the antique marketplace. In 2013, folks from Ontario might remember that the two-level market building that was built in the 80s was actually destroyed in a fire. It, I think, wasn't up to modern code. It was up to code when they built it, but they hadn't installed sprinklers, and unfortunately something caught fire and they lost the building. The community did rally around them a lot, though. They got a lot of support. In 2015, the replacement building is completed. In 2017, it changes hands from one local family-owned development business to another local family-owned business, and that is where they end their history timeline. We've got a couple images here just to show how it's grown over time. On the left, we have a newspaper clipping from the 50s that shows the original stockyard market. And then on the right, we've got an image from 2012. So this is going to be prior to this building burning down, but anecdotally, as someone that was at St. Jacobs last year prior to the pandemic, they recreated it pretty accurately. You've got two levels, lovely barn-looking building, full of vendors and consumers and excellent smells. If you get a chance to go sometime, I think it's worth it. There's a lot of good food. So now we're on to the modern usage of the St. Jacobs Market District. All of this is not COVID related. I didn't want to take that into account. This comes from how they were operating prior to COVID and hopefully how they will continue to operate post-COVID. It seemed a little unfair to judge what's happening now as part of their normal because it's clearly not. Anyway, so the St. Jacobs Market District involves kind of three main sub-businesses as a part of this district. There's the farmers market, which is probably what a lot of people think of first. It's open 2 to 3 days a week, depending on the season. 3 days in the summer, 2 in the off season. Features hundreds of different vendors from growers, butchers, farmers, crafters. You've got miscellaneous small businesses. A lot of emphasis on local to like southern Ontario. They've also got their Market Roads Antique, which is open 7 days a week. You've got, again, more than 100 vendors. It's a lot of antiques and collectibles. And then across the street from those two buildings is the Outlet Mall, open 7 days a week, featuring top brand outlets. It's got an interesting mix of stores. It's got a toy store that I always thought was a Lego store, but apparently actually isn't. It just sells a lot of Lego. There's a kitchen store, some clothing outlets, a place that sells a lot of fancy china. It's kind of an interesting, unique outlet mall. So this is kind of how the market district is being used today. So the reflection question for this topic was to briefly describe how Peter Jackson sees the relationship between culture and consumption, and then discuss why the popularity of St. Jacobs Market is tied to ideas about scale, especially the local. So Jackson sees culture as being created through shared norms, such as similar behaviors, taste, similar symbols or use of symbols, as well as being created through sites of struggle. I'm going to focus more on the shared norms when it comes to St. Jacob's market. Sites of struggle, from what I was reading, a little bit less relevant to the market district. There are some struggles involved with the town of St. Jacobs because of the increased tourism over the past 30 to 40 years or so, but I focus this presentation on the market district and not the town, so we're not going to get into the details of the conflicts at this time. Jackson also studies how consumption plays into culture. It says that consumption is how culture is locally expressed, especially in a globalizing and restructuring economy. It's also socially influenced and tied to an individual's self-identity, and it's affected by and also affects the dominant political economic structures that are influencing consumption. So the political economic system affects culture, and then the culture itself also affects what the political economic structure looks like. Jackson also wrote about food and how the act of buying and eating food is multifaceted. You've got the physical side, which is what you need to eat to live. There's the economic side. Can you afford to eat? Can you afford to eat healthy? What foods are available to you in your price range? There's the technical side. So that's what your palate or the cultural palate is. How easy is it for you to access or cook food? How convenient are things? There's also a political act or political side to food. Who are you choosing to buy from? Are there brands or foods or products that are being boycotted? There's also a cultural aspect. So the example given by Dr. Silver was poutine, where Canada, especially kind of Ontario and really in Quebec, not an uncommon food. Might not be eating it regularly. It's not very healthy, but we tend to deeply enjoy it. Whereas a kind of soggy mess of gravy and cheese curds might be unappealing to folks that didn't grow up with it. And then there's also the emotional side to food. So that's how we're caring for ourselves. It's how we care for our family. It can be a way that we demonstrate how much we care for someone is by being able to provide them with a good meal or a nice treat if we like to bake or buy things. And that's kind of how food plays into all of this. Now I'm going to touch on St. Jacob's popularity and scale. So St. Jacob's Market District is marketed as part of the St. Jacob's Country Experience. So it is kind of tied to the St. Jacobs town, and they do, at least for tourism's sake, market themselves as an experience. And it is kind of a commodification of rural heritage. So they're really the idea of something being local is really heavily tied to their business plan and also why people go there to shop and to experience. They want to be able to buy from local, fresh produce, local small businesses. They also like to eat the food from the vendors there, and it's being sold as a very local experience. Or things, the people that you meet there are people that live and work nearby, or at least in southern Ontario somewhere. They also focus on the farm to table aspect of it, so it's again a very local idea. Farm to table is often understood as well. I think it's often understood as being healthier. It's not necessarily healthier, but the public perception of farm to table, I think, because you can see the farm and theoretically drive by the farm and see it, and then eat the food. We understand it as being healthier. We like to support people that live close to us. We see them as part of our community. And then, of course, there's the history and tradition that St. Jacobs plays off of, both of going to a farmer's market being that's got a lot of historical roots to it. It's a much more older way to buy your food than going to the Zares or the Metro. And then St. Jacobs, of course, is also in an area with a lot of Mennonites living nearby. You also get Mennonite vendors at St. Jacobs, so that, for a lot of folks, really, the Mennonite people are rooted in a lot of tradition, so that adds to the way that St. Jacobs is selling itself. And one of the experiences that people are looking for when they go to the St. Jacobs market is to be in touch with things a little bit more historical or traditional. I think this is even emphasized by the fact that they have an entire building dedicated to antiques. They really are trying to sell history and tradition as part of their experience. And here's a quick look at the references. A lot of the information I got about St. Jacobs I pulled from their own website and from their Facebook because I really want to know how I wanted to see how that they were selling themselves and not what other people thought of it as much. I wanted to get it much more from them. What are they emphasizing? What do they think is important to put on their own websites? What images are they showing on their Facebook? That kind of thing. So that's why I emphasize really heavily on just what does St. Jacobs say about itself. And that is my 20 minutes. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something.